So we now move to our next session, which is, as I said, New York labor struggles in the post-World War II era. And I'm going to be passing off my role to Kim Phillips Fine. Professor Fine is a professor of American history at New York University and the author of Invisible Hands, the businessman's crusade against the New Deal. So welcome to Kim, and welcome to our next set of panelists. Thank you all.
Hi, well, let me start out by saying that it's a great honor to chair this panel today. I wish that we were together in person, of course, and especially that it was possible to see Josh directly, but it's wonderful to be here today and really special. My first encounter with working class New York came when I was a graduate student, and I reviewed the book for In These Times. The review was called Red Gotham, and while the actual text of this review has been lost to posterity, I believe that I ended by noting that the book left me wanting to know more about the fiscal crisis, which would ultimately become the subject of my second book. I then met Josh, who was on my dissertation committee, and I know that I'm not alone in being able to testify to his generosity and kindness as an interlocutor and a friend ever since. Like many here today, I imagine, working class New York had an immediate and powerful effect on me. And most directly, I really knew after reading it, that I wanted to write about the city's fiscal crisis someday. But more deeply, I think working class New York explained to me something vital about the city where I had grown up, placing my own experience in a broad historical context and offering me a new way of seeing a place that was so important to me. So many accounts of New York focus on the wrong things, on the restaurants, the museums, the architecture, most of all, in a way, the money of the city, a particular version of the high culture and the lifestyle the city promises to extend. And it's not that those things, especially the restaurants, the museums, those things are important, but for me, none of them really explain the wonders of this city. And Working Class New York did more than almost any other book to help me gain real insight into what accounts for the distinctiveness and the constant surprises offered by this vast, familiar, dear, and unknowable place. I remember talking with Josh when I was finishing Fear City, and which is about the fiscal crisis of 1975 and its aftermath in New York. He was one of the relatively few scholars who read the whole manuscript prior to publication, another sign of his generosity. And at the end of our conversation, I remember him emphasizing to me the tenacity of the public sector in the city. The way once won, it was not easily dismantled despite all the myriad assaults upon it. CUNY, the subway system, the parks, the libraries, all of this may be battered and defunded, but it endures and it continues to shape in deep ways what the city is now. And I remember him telling me about walking through Chelsea, looking at the public housing that is still there in that neighborhood in the middle of a totally insane real estate market and thinking, isn't it amazing that this is still here, that this endures? Working Class New York is a deeply generative book. It contains so much and is so rich that it has opened up questions that have inspired and moved a generation of scholars. And today we're going to hear from 4 of these. And at the end, I'll reflect a bit more on their work and the questions it raises for Josh's book today. First, we will hear from Pramila Nadasan, who is a professor of history at Barnard College, who writes about poor and working class women of color and their visions of social change. She is the author of Household Workers Unite, the untold story of African-American women who built a movement, and Welfare Warriors, the welfare rights movement in the United States. Next up will be Will Jones. He is professor and director of graduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota, and also the president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. He is the author of The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights, and is currently writing a book about race and public employment in the 20th century United States. Then we will hear from 2 of Josh's graduate students, or people who have been Josh's graduate students. First is Andy Battle, who is currently an instructor in the Bird Sequence program and an editor at Common Notions. And finally is Mark Kagan, who is a PhD candidate in the CUNY Graduate Center History Department. And his dissertation, still in progress, is entitled The Fall and Rise and Fall of Transport Workers Union Local 100, Workers, Unions, and Working Class Power in New York City, 1975 to 2009. So Pramila, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kim. I'm really honored to be here for the celebration of Working Class New York and Josh Freeman's distinguished career. I've had the opportunity to know and work with Josh over many years. I've witnessed him collaborating on projects like Who Built America, the American Social History Project, giving lectures or running workshops for unions, curating exhibits for museums, such as the most recent one at the Museum of the City of New York. Josh not only writes about working class New York, but he engages with and teaches working class New Yorkers. At the heart of Josh's book are questions about the kind of city New York is. Whose city is New York? Who are the power brokers? These are important questions for thinking about how history unfolds and the role of working class people in shaping urban spaces. I want to ask a related question about what is the working class and who is a worker. Working class New York elevated the municipal workers, the teachers, the transit workers, the healthcare workers, the police unions. But there's another category of workers, often invisible, who are equally essential, who didn't organize into the traditional unions and are often not a part of the narrative. Yet I would argue that they're a critical component of the working class, and even more important under neoliberalism. I'm thinking here about domestic workers, housewives, street vendors, sex workers, day laborers, delivery people, and the growing number of contingent workers. People who we might refer to as precarious workers, but who have always labored and organized in the city. How we answer the question of what is the working class is important, both as a historiographical and a political question. The working class has been equated with industrial workers, often white male workers or the trade union movement. And I think it's important to distinguish between the union movement, the labor movement, and working class struggle. Josh expands our notion of the union movement by placing service and municipal workers at the heart of his story. But if we consider the labor movement more broadly, we can account for people who formed other kinds of labor associations, such as domestic workers and day laborers. Working class struggle, I think, is broader and can include, for example, housewives protesting the high price of meat, tenants who organized anti-eviction campaigns, welfare rights activists who demanded higher monthly payments, or Black Lives Matter activists demanding reinvestment in Black communities. Our narratives of labor history were driven by a relatively small group of white men who led the trade union movement. Their stories have influenced the historiography and determined key moments. So the 1930s, for example, is considered a significant decade for unionization. Working class New York shifts our chronological focus to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s by tracing the rise of municipal unions. But I wonder what our chronology of working class struggle would look like if we centered informal or precarious workers. The association of the working class with industrial workers or the trade union movement has also shaped political analysis about liberalism and conservatism. There's a tendency within the left to distinguish between class on the one hand and race and gender politics on the other hand, between the working class and people engaged in anti-racist and feminist organizing. So the politics of race and gender are assumed to be in tension with and to distract from real working class issues. But too often, anti-racist and feminist organizing is framed simplistically as identity politics. And Josh's work, I should say, has focused on the very diverse workforce of New York and has helped push back against this simplistic analysis. Some on the left have blamed the growing conservatism of the white working class and their embrace of the Republican Party on identity politics. So the Democratic Party, cancel culture, the affirmative action, and affirmative action, we are told, have alienated the working class. But this narrative erases the large swaths of working class people of color from the political landscape. People who continue to identify as Democrats or liberals or leftists. People who, perhaps more importantly, are leading the way for a new kind of labor movement. Shifting our gaze to the informal sector not only offers a different chronology, as I mentioned before, but it helps us redefine what counts as work. So we can consider home-based work, as Eileen Boris has written about, or washerwomen, as Tara Hunter has written about. We can consider boarding houses or unpaid labor in the home. LaShawn Harris has a wonderful book about Black women and the underground economy, and her focus is on psychic sex workers and numbers runners. A focus on precarious work can also help us rethink the relationship of class to race and gender. For informal workers, who are largely white women and people of color, their labor and their status as workers, their occupational choices are inseparable from race and gender. For them, the history of settler colonialism, slavery, indenture, immigration, both reproduction and the paid and unpaid labor of social reproduction means that the economic history of the US cannot be disentangled from race and gender. Shifting our gaze to these workers suggests that racialized and gendered capitalism is a better conceptual framework to think about the evolution of US labor history. Informal workers also illustrate new forms of organizing. Agricultural workers, domestic workers, and many other categories of workers, including the public sector workers that Will Jones is writing about, were excluded from the New Deal. They were denied minimum wage, Social Security, the right to organize and bargain collectively. So the New Deal legitimated and institutionalized a hierarchy among workers. It also reinforced a circumscribed definition of the working class, privileging some and marginalizing others. Because these workers were denied the protection of the National Labor Relations Act, they found much more innovative ways of organizing. They offered models, and because of that, they offer models for organizing challenges today. They often turn to social movement unionism. They organize not in their places of employment, but in worker centers or in public places such as playgrounds and buses. They organize state-based rather than employer-based protections. They reached out to both documented and undocumented workers. And they organized across racial, ethnic, and linguistic lines. The heterogeneity of the working class has become even more important with the shift from industrial capitalism to neoliberal capitalism. We've seen a decline in manufacturing. So in 2019, only about 13% of the workforce was in the goods producing industries, which includes mining, construction, and manufacturing. But 80% of the workforce was in the service sector. There has also been a redefinition of what it means to work. 50 years ago, a full-time job meant benefits, job security, health insurance. That's not true today, except for a privileged few. According to the Government Accounting Office in 2015, 40% of American workers are contingent. That is, they have few benefits and very little worker protections. Contingency is increasingly the norm for American workers. Contingent workers, many of whom are in the service sector, are the driving force of the American economy. Their importance has become more visible with the pandemic as mostly Black, brown, and women essential workers put their lives on the line to care for the sick, clean and sanitize, deliver groceries, drive buses, cars, and trains. They're also doing the unpaid labor of care work, taking care of family members and homeschooling their children. And they are organizing. The narrative of the labor movement is one of a slow and steady expansion of labor rights to include those who've been excluded. It's a narrative of progress. I propose a different narrative of progress, one in which we increasingly learn from excluded workers how we can better organize. Their models of organizing, often outside formal union structures, could point to a way forward in a neoliberal economy. We can turn to the Fight for 15 movement, home healthcare aides, domestic workers, agricultural workers, Uber drivers. They have taught us how to build movements across racial and ethnic lines, how to connect to other struggles globally, how to mobilize the documented and the undocumented, how to provide broad-based protections for workers regardless of who employs them. More importantly, a focus on this sector might suggest that although the union movement has experienced decline, the labor movement is thriving. I would argue that informal and contingent workers are and always have been a central part of working class New York. Like the public sector and municipal workers who Josh so eloquently writes about, they make the city run, and they're the ones who will ensure that New York will retain its social democratic ethos. Thank you.
Wonderful. Next, we have Will Jones.
Thanks, Kim. And thanks, Josh, for writing many great books, including this one, and for being the inspiration for this conversation. I'm really happy to be here and honored. I want to start by just talking about one scene, which I have a picture of. I don't know if we can show an image. Okay, great. And this I'll leave it up for a little bit, but then I won't need it for most of my presentation. But I wanted to just begin with this scene. It takes place on a cool April morning it's like the one here in Minnesota. I don't know what the weather's like there in New York, but in 1946. And I like this image for a number of reasons. I think the slogan on the sign, it also shows Ewart Guinier in the background, which if those of you who don't recognize his name probably recognize his daughter Lonnie's face in his face. So on this, at this demonstration, several thousand city workers marched on a budget hearing in New York City in 1946. As you can see, they were carrying signs reading, "We need a living wage to feed our kids." They rallied outside City Hall and then sent union leaders inside to address the Board of Estimates. Ewart Guinier, who was a former city employee who had just returned from military service in the Pacific, emphasized the plight of helpers and assistants in city hospitals, who he explained toiled 48 hours, 6 days a week, and still earned so little that they qualified for public assistance. He said, "Large numbers of these workers are women and Negroes. This means that the same policy that prevails in the city of paying Negroes the lowest wages for the hardest jobs is being practiced by the city." Eleanor Godding, who led a union in the welfare department, pointed out that low wages saved the city little money, as they merely shifted the costs of supporting workers' families from the payroll to the welfare roll. And insisting that increased wages and welfare supports could be funded by increasing taxes on wealthy landowners, Ewart Guinier and Eleanor Godding urged officials to, quote, "raise city workers to meet the standards of private industry," while capping their shifts at 40 hours, 5 days a week, and granting permanent status in the city's civil service system for all city employees. In seeking to bring the wages and working conditions of hospital workers in line with the standards of private industry without cutting public services, Guinier and Godding confronted a contradiction that lay at the heart of the homegrown version of social democracy that Josh points out made life in New York unlike that in any other place in the post-war United States. Municipal hospitals, of course, were key components of the decentralized yet comprehensive healthcare system that provided medical service and insurance to groups previously at the mercy of fate and charity. And according to Josh, put the city on a different path than the rest of the country. With the defeat of proposals for universal federally funded health insurance, working class New Yorkers relied on their unions to secure access to insurance and, in some cases, hospital care. Ironically, as employees of governments or charitable nonprofits, hospital workers themselves were excluded, as Pramila points out, from the National Labor Relations Act, which protected workers' rights to form unions and bargain collectively in private industry. And as a result, those workers earned far less than other workers and often lacked access to their own health insurance and other benefits that their private sector counterparts won through unionization. The expansion of employer, union, and charity-based health programs also diverted funding and political support from the municipal hospitals and other public programs in the post-war era. So in many respects, this scene, this protest by hospital workers, I think highlights several themes that are central to working class New York. One is, of course, the attention to public employees, which for Josh goes back to In Transit. And I think really distinguishes all of Josh's work, and particularly working class New York, from other labor historians who have largely overlooked public sector. It also highlights the contradictions of the public sector in the post-war era, which was characterized by an underinvestment, a neglect, the exclusion from New Deal labor protections that, as Pramila notes, is similar to, and I think deeply related to, the exclusion of domestic workers and agriculture from those same protections. And in fact, I think a lot of the connection comes with the association of public work with domestic work, and the filling of those jobs by women and people of color in many ways, again, similar and echoing the ideologies that led to the exclusion of domestic work. But at the same time, we see this underinvestment and neglect coupled with this sort of centrality of this work to the functioning of the city, the reliance of the city on these hospital workers or domestic workers or other people who are seen as, again, sort of simultaneously not workers and yet sort of the most important workers. And in that way, I think this really echoes our current debate about infrastructure, about care work, about essential work in the pandemic. Another, I think, important theme that this scene highlights is the response of workers, which is, of course, really central to Josh's work. The way in which they push back and seek to address these contradictions. In this case, emphasizing the centrality of race and gender to working class experience. And I think, again, this is where Josh really breaks from the dominant narrative. He sees the the dominant narrative, which in terms of the public sector, when it does pay attention to public sector work, often sees it as something that emerges in the 1960s and 1970s, often inspired by the new collective bargaining laws that are passed in the 60s and 70s, or by the civil rights movement and feminist movements. But I think Josh accurately emphasizes the continuities in public sector unionism between the immediate post-war era and the era of the 1960s and 70s. Of course, the union that Guinier and Godding belonged to, the United Public Workers of America, we know from Josh's work, was destroyed by anti-communism in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 50s. But as Josh also points out, it laid important seeds for the unions that took off in the 1960s and 70s, most importantly, in both the demand for equality with other workers, characterized primarily by the the expansion of collective bargaining rights or other protections, Social Security, for example, for hospital workers and other municipal employees, but also in the way in which their understanding of those inequalities were rooted in an understanding of race and gender inequality, right? And so the coupling of race and gender politics with a class politics. And in some ways, I think the neglect of public sector workers more broadly, I think, robs us of a really successful case of pushing back against those exclusions, particularly in large cities like New York. But just as I think this protest highlights important contradictions of working class New York, I think it suggests that the story that Josh tells may not be so unique. There's no question that New York in many respects was unusual. It was far larger than any other city in the United States. It had a much more diverse economy and a rich networks of unions, of left organizations, civil rights organizations. But that contradiction that the United Public Workers confronted in 1946 was a nationwide contradiction and one deeply rooted in the history of the United States. It was a contradiction that led public sector unionism to grow in the 1940s across the United States. And in fact, the United Public Workers established very powerful unions across the United States, including in the South and in US territories. So it's actually its largest local by the end of 1946 was in the Panama Canal Zone, which is where Guinier was from, and they established a local among largely non-US citizens who were employed by the United States to provide services for US citizens in the Canal Zone. They also established powerful locals in Hawaii, and in fact, the main public sector federation in Hawaii continues to be known as the United Public Workers of Hawaii. This union was expelled from the CIO, destroyed largely by a backlash. Ewart Guinier left the labor movement and went on to establish the Black Studies program at Harvard. But these local organizations survived and I think played a really key role in understanding the labor movement in the 1960s and 1970s. And so in many respects, I think Josh got it right for New York, but would argue that New York City was in many respects less exceptional, both chronologically and geographically, than we might assume. And I think for that reason, I think it offers important lessons that we can take away from Josh's great work. So I look forward to this conversation. And again, I really appreciate being part of this.
Thank you. Now we have Andy Battle. And I should say I neglected to mention this in the introductions initially, but Andy defended his dissertation in 2019, and the dissertation is titled Runaway, A History of Post-War New York in 4 Factories.
Okay, well, thank you, Kim, and hello to everyone out there, and especially hi to Josh, and congratulations on an incredibly meaningful career. My name's Andy. I was one of Josh's students. I graduated in 2019 with a dissertation on runaway plants or factories that left New York for the American South or abroad between 1945 and 1975. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the experience of reading working class New York led in a direct way to the work that I'm doing as a historian. So I promised Josh I would keep my working class New York epiphany story very short. So very briefly, I came to grad school. I knew I wanted to study in New York. I began with a more cultural approach. I was converted, you could say, to the critique of political economy. And I discovered in this book a way to combine a focus on political economy with attention to lives as they are concretely lived in and through institutions. So why did the book have such a big impact? I think there were 3 main reasons. One, it was a survey in the best sense of the word, not just an introduction to New York City in the post-war era, but an introduction to municipal politics, to labor sociology, to historical political economy, to industrial geography, to the history and theory of social democracy. Two, it brought back a world that those of us born after its collapse didn't necessarily know about, but one that still shapes our own, especially if we live in New York. And this was a historical experience, a set of politics, a set of convictions that, while profoundly imperfect, may have provided more propitious conditions for liberation than the ones we're living with now. And then three, it did all that in a way that brought serious archival research to a general audience. And it was written in the way that history books can and should be written if we want them to make an impact in the world. So the book was incredibly fruitful, not least for the way that it felt like in every chapter or like in every paragraph, there was a dissertation there. And that's what happened to me. So I came in part through Josh's work to understand that deindustrialization was at the center of the way cities had been transformed in the post-war era. What working class New York did was to explain a geographically, historically, and politically specific political economy of manufacturing. Probably the paradigmatic example of the political economy that Josh described, what he called a non-Fordist city in the age of Ford, is the garment industry. So I thought I would just share a little of my work on the garment industry and then suggest how it might speak to some of the broader questions that Josh was asking. And if it's possible to show the slide of the picketing garment workers just for a minute or two, that would be great. If not, no big deal. So my project for the dissertation ended up being to look as deeply as I could into particular factors to understand what caused them to leave New York when they did. And for the garment industry, I looked at Judy Bond, a well-known blouse maker whose departure for Alabama in 1961 was felt to be a sort of Waterloo for the garment industry in the Northeast, and for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in particular, which was a key institution in the municipal social democracy that Josh described. Now, the thing to understand about the garment industry is that its competitive dynamics are particularly brutal. It has a very low cost of entry, meager capitalization, a labor-intensive work process, crowded markets, thin profits, low wages, a relentless search for surplus labor, and consequently, a staunch resistance to unionization. And those things work in a feedback loop. So the inability to mechanize garment work beyond simple tools like sewing machines means that virtually anyone can enter the business. It's very easy to pirate styles. All you have to do is go down to Macy's or Gimbel's and look at them, and that's what people did. For that reason, markets get saturated very quickly. No one can maintain a competitive edge for very long or amass enough capital to expand, and the key variable in the business becomes the cost of labor. So how do you keep it down? Well, by making sure that the potential labor force is as large as possible. The main way to do that is through contracting, which is a preference for temporary contingent employment. So contracting permits manufacturers to reduce overhead costs by passing them on to others. In doing so, they achieve what is euphemistically called flexibility, or the ability to quickly expand or contract production. They dissociate themselves from legal and moral responsibility for working conditions, and crucially, they increase the size of the potential labor force, permitting them to set workers in competition against one another and creating downward pressure on wages and conditions. So a well-known practice in the garment industry was to acquire as many contractors as possible and play them off of one another in a system of arbitrage that was known in the business as the auction block. The way that I think of contracting is that it's like a machine to shift risk downward until the uncertainties of a fiercely competitive and unpredictable industry are loaded onto the backs of those least equipped to bear them. Okay, so the goal of the union, in its own words, was to, quote, bring some semblance of reason and peace to the industry. And I think those are significant words, reason and peace. But to do this, you had to be able to locate, surveil, and organize the majority of the shops in the industry, which is a bewildering task to begin with because garment shops tend to be really small and it's really easy to open new ones. And then engineer through collective bargaining a kind of social democratic equilibrium for the industry, whose goal is to accommodate, on the one hand, tolerable wages and working conditions, and on the other, tolerable profitability for employers. Now, the garment unions have been trying to do this since they were founded. So like the Protocols of Peace in 1910 are a well-known attempt to do that. But those efforts always foundered on the persistence of contracting, which then itself facilitates geographical relocation or the runaway shop. So contracting is disaggregation in the eyes of the law. Runaways are disaggregation in geographical space. And the first runaways in the garment industry are to places like Staten Island in the teens, where raincoat makers, for example, relocated to escape the union and to fend it off with the help of local politicians and friendly judges. So that's one important point, is that runaways are an attempt to recover the direct political domination that is being eroded by the burgeoning political power of the unions in New York. So the union tries to fight these trends with three principles. One, transparency. Manufacturers should maintain a stable set of contractors and tell the union who they are. Two, limitation. Manufacturers should only farm out work to a second contractor once the first is at capacity, so no more auction block. Three, equalization of wages and conditions across all shops. And in theory, this would eliminate the auction block, stabilize employment in the industry, make it legible and therefore vulnerable to organization. Now, the union was never strong enough to implement those principles until the New Deal, when the support of the federal government, however partial and imperfect, gave them the leverage to cement those provisions. The National Industrial Recovery Act also fostered the cartelization of the industry in an attempt to discourage price competition among manufacturers. So even when the act was struck down by the Supreme Court, the union and the more established manufacturers worked to maintain those arrangements through trade associations and collective bargaining, maintaining in effect a kind of private National Recovery Administration. The goal for the union is to establish an equilibrium by which firms can maintain profitability while tolerating unionization and avoiding resort to the sweatshop, because the free market outcome of the garment industry has always been the sweatshop. It's worth noting also that this is a project that is rooted in New York City and its political culture. So garment shop owners and garment unionists often have like shared, basically interchangeable backgrounds, as do arbitrators, judges, and local politicians tasked with administering this. Now, as time goes on, I think this is where the gradual consolidation of whiteness actually becomes a big problem in garment industry and in garment unionism. But the other thing that happens is that as soon as this tenuous stability is secured, you get a new round of runaways. The temptation to get what in the industry was called the edge is too great and it's too easy. There are opportunities, especially in the newly deindustrialized textile towns of New England, but especially in the former coal mining towns of northeastern Pennsylvania. So these places have something that manufacturers want. One, isolation. So the dense urban industrial districts of New York City that Josh described in his book fostered communication and organization. So like the garment district, one union official joked, was like a fishbowl equipped with loudspeakers. Like everyone knows how much people are making, everyone knows who's paying what, everyone knows who's doing what. The small towns, on the other hand, are isolated from one another. Like at this time, a river or a mountain is a real barrier. Two, they have great concentrations of desperate women who are urbanized, proletarian, and jobless. And this is the stuff that garment capitalist dreams are made of then and now. And three, just as had been the case in Staten Island, direct political domination is part of the formula. The coal towns have oligarchies going back to the days of the Molly Maguires in some cases. The local governments are linked to organized crime, as has been shown in recent work by David Whitwer and Catherine Rios. And these towns are not democracies in any meaningful sense. In a lot of them, women don't actually have the right to vote in a de facto way. So at this point, between 1935 and the late 1950s, the industry settles into a 4 or 5 state swath of the Northeast that economists called the New York production area, where design, cutting, and sales take place in Manhattan, but sewing takes place in the hinterland, basically anywhere that's reachable overnight via truck. So trucking and highway infrastructure is part of this story too. The union's job, as they see it, is to organize the New York production area so that it can contain the effective size of the reserve army, increase its leverage with existing employers, and safeguard wages and working conditions in existing shops. But the centrifugal forces are there. The reputable manufacturers really have no choice but to follow the rogue ones. If they don't, they will be undersold and lose the market. These are dynamics that will intensify significantly with the emergence of imports in the 1950s. But the main point is that these market dynamics throughout the history of the garment industry outrun all attempts to regulate them. So there's a lot more to this story in terms of the emergence of imports, the collapse of the New York production area, the flight of garment makers like Judy Bond to the American South, to Haiti and beyond. But to conclude here, I'll just say a couple things about New York. One, the consequences of deindustrialization were great. On top of individual catastrophes of joblessness, you have the subtraction of manufacturing from the city's political economy, a crisis of tax revenue, the collapse of the institutions that organized the working class politically, and a hollowing out of municipal politics that left elites in the finance and real estate industries in a virtually unchallenged position, helping to make escalating real estate values and the politics that accompany them, such as aggressive policing, the sine qua non of city politics. And the other thing, and I think this gets to some of the bigger questions Josh was asking, is what is the character and what were the limits of this municipal social democracy? We know that it had serious limits in terms of race and gender. It was not a genuinely universal project. In addition to that, there were limits on the whole project, rooted in the dynamics of competition themselves, which is a nice way of saying capitalism. The New Deal settlement in the garment industry, in my estimation, founded on the contradictions that often beset social democratic projects whose political jurisdictions do not coincide with the geographical dimensions of the markets they seek to temper, but on which they ultimately rely. So very schematically, we could say that only robust trade protection, which was geopolitically unthinkable in the post-war era, or on the other hand, a nationwide or indeed a worldwide New Deal could have maybe maintained the conditions for durable garment capitalism in New York and in the United States more generally. Absent that, the question becomes, can you have half capitalism in one place? And the answer historically was no. And I think this is where we can bring Josh's work together with political theory. So I'm thinking just, for example, like Adam Zaworski on the incommensurability of market and non-market rationalities, Klaus Offe on capital strikes and the limits of the welfare state, Robert Brenner on what he called the paradox of social democracy, whereby the integration of once proscribed workers' movements into the state machinery demands the suppression of the mass direct action that imbued those movements with their disruptive capacities. In all, what you find, or what I find, is that in the post-war era, at the very moment that organizations like the Garment Workers Union were working to consolidate and to broaden this municipal social democracy, its conditions of possibility were evaporating. And what strikes me is how profoundly unstable, short-lived, and historically contingent this dispensation was. And so if your goal is a society free from exploitation, in which everyone is afforded basic material security and the opportunity to flourish in whatever direction they feel called, I think that being aware of this historical experience returns us to questions around political strategy and around the question of transition that are being debated right now in the socialist movement, and rightly so. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And now we will hear from Mark Kagan.
Thank you. It's very cool to be here today and to be honoring Josh like this. My dissertation, which Josh wishes I would hurry up and complete, is about Transport Workers Union, TWU Local 100, from the time of the fiscal crisis onward, and especially about the attempts of a dissident caucus within it to revitalize that union and New York City labor. So you can see how this flows directly from a sort of synthesis of working class New York and Josh's first book, In Transit, both in terms of content and methodology. I've always thought that In Transit was a one industry version of Fall of the House of Labor. I was a transit worker when I read this book, and it rang completely true to me. I think this is the highest compliment that can be paid, not just to a historian, but any writer. Josh had listened to his informants and given them voice rather than tried to impose his own categories or story on them. And the chapter of that book I give to my own students is called The Fruits of Victory. Josh stops his chronological progression to tell us what a union, what working class success meant to workers in their everyday lives. Higher wages, vacations, medical checkups. Josh has a favorite quote from Jack Metzger: "If this wasn't liberation, then liberation never happens in real human lives." But the chapter is also about workers' newfound power in the workplace. I think this is so important. After all, what working class New York also is about is power. Who has it? For what purposes is it wielded? Let me read you a passage. Quote, "Where workers labored in large groups, they were best able to assert their power. Militant individuals often played a key role in breaking old patterns. Eddie Cabral, for instance, a steward at the IRT 98th Street shop, ended a ban on having coffee in work areas by simply arriving one day with a coffee pot and giving out coffee, mocking the foreman who challenged him." Mocking. I can just imagine Eddie, who Josh tells us in a later anecdote was known as a hothead even in the union, telling Josh this story. The TWU was the end of slavery, workers said. They had more power. Unfortunately, what can be won from management can be wrested back. A key moment I write about came in 1984, when a new MTA head and TA president were appointed with the mission to reassert management control. In their most notorious act, they hired Ronald Bullwhip Davis, to run the 207th Street Overhaul shop, a shop which was mostly African American, which the union still ran. He really did have a bullwhip, which he proudly displayed to the New York Post. Could we put up that picture now for a second? That's pretty remarkable, huh? Okay, you can take it down, thanks. He cleaned out all the coffee stations in the shop and refrigerators and grills, and he mocked the workers. There were actually still plenty of Eddie Cabrals at 207th Street, and they fought for months. The shop's production plummeted to almost nothing, but in the end, they were defeated because that shop was left isolated. The shop and the workers were left isolated to fight on their own. And because when the shop's union officers were suspended, put in the street in transit terminology, the union leadership left them twisting in the wind. That story brings us back to the real Eddie Cabral. In 1947, transit had altered the job schedules, the so-called PICs, of some train operators and conductors in ways those workers and the TWU deemed unsatisfactory. First, those workers refused to pick. Then a slowdown began among those workers, and it spread to all the subway lines. At 148th Street repair shop, Eddie, who was now a union chair, briefly stopped all work in solidarity. For that, he got fired under the provisions of the state's just enacted anti-strike Condon-Wadlin Act. In the end, though, the union won. Cabral got his job back, the pick was changed, and it was the head of transit that lost his job later that year. The contrast among these three stories is to me symbolic of the decline of this once powerful union, and it got worse in succeeding decades, and of this once powerful New York City labor movement, to the point where it is absurd to call it a movement, although Pramila has suggested a different way of thinking about the labor movement, which maybe we should talk about later. Well, what had happened? Here's where we turn to working class New York. If In Transit is Josh's David Montgomery book, then Working Class New York is his Herbert Gutman book, a community study on just about the largest scale imaginable. In some ways, it's a love letter to New York and New Yorkers, right? And if you read it backwards, it's a parable, I think, of what Josh wishes New York could be again, a social democratic city, the apotheosis of the New Deal. This is the fruits of victory writ large, the economic and social ambitions of a single union, enlarged, not without warts, into the political and economic agenda of New York's working class, primarily through the efforts of their unions, which had a broad vision of their responsibility and goals. It's about how ordinary people can play a role in shaping their unordinary city. In fact, I'm just cribbing from Josh's aspiration at the end of his introduction, where he writes, "I do hope this book illuminates the possibilities for ordinary people to play a greater role in shaping their city and nation than they do today." So what happened? Of course, there were the structural elements to New York's version of the urban crisis. We get more of them in Kim's detailed study or in Josh's American Empire, where we're really at the macro level. But in working class New York, I think Josh is more interested in questions of agency, the end of an expansive imagination by unions about winning and wielding social power, their failures on race, their increasing concern only with their own members, the loss of class solidarity. These were choices that were not foreordained, even if Josh shows us the reasons for them. And then doom, the fiscal crisis and the fall of New York's working class. I'd like to highlight a story Josh tells. In June 1975, the Municipal Labor Coalition, which even as I speak is in the process of agreeing to cut Medicare benefits for city retirees, called a demonstration outside the headquarters of Citibank. Remember, this is a municipal labor force that had not yet been chastened. They did not know 50 years of concessions were coming. That demonstration frightened business leaders who Josh says were not used to direct populist attacks on their institutions. Felix Rohatyn called it, quote, a very, very scary kind of experience. And Josh goes on, quote, the success of the demonstration and the anger it revealed seemed to frighten Gottbaum too, Victor Gottbaum, head of New York's largest union, who soon became one of the strongest union advocates of seeking an accommodation with the city and business leaders to avoid default. So fear of his own members and accommodation. Here is our last almost 50 years in just one sentence. Josh's chapter on the fiscal crisis ends with his transit workers, and this is where my narrative begins, with their oh so close effort to challenge an austerity regime. They didn't know yet that workers were licked. In 1978 and 79, they built a powerful dissident movement and forced their own fearful and accommodationist union president to call the 1980 transit strike. As a technical matter, they won that strike. They came back with far more money than Transit's final offer, enough more to pay off the Taylor Law fines for breaking New York's anti-strike laws in little more than a year. Yet they came to believe they had lost due to the abrupt way the strike was ended, the immediate impact of those fines, and the drumbeat, not only from their own union leadership, but other municipal unions, that the strike was a failure. For 2 decades, demoralized, they slid backwards, contractually and in the workplace. The legacy of the fiscal crisis was that New York City labor became scared of its own shadow. But agency cuts both ways. Perhaps what was lost can be wrested back from management. A new generation of radicals and activists and workers not reconciled to defeat began to emerge in the 1990s. The radicals I write about shared goals of transformation with Josh's Communist Party and Irish Republican Army radicals, yet his organized in the midst of nationwide upsurge with tailwinds behind them, and mine tried to do the same in the face of neoliberalism's headwinds. His created radical industrial trade unionism, and mine were trying to reinvent it. Who can say which is the harder task, but they're different tasks anyway. His transit workers hated transit, and so did mine, with their anger about what they now called plantation justice and guilty till proven innocent. Yet they're different insofar as in the preceding decades, mine had become habituated to what we now call service union. So it's not the same story. But one of the first things my dissident union caucus did when we took over TW Local 100 in 2001 was to ask Josh Freeman to write a monthly column in our new union newspaper. And we bought 1,000 copies of In Transit to give to the new shop stewards we were training. Understand your history. Understand what you are capable of. Now, in the end, it was a flawed effort. The path back to expansive imagination, to class solidarity, to wielding social power was too difficult. Too much headwind, too many crises, and too little interrogation of choices and actions made it too easy to slide back into old bad habits and doomed the efforts to make transformative change. Yet one thing I think I share with Josh is a glass half full view, not a naive optimism, but perennial belief that the work we do of analysis and explication matters and will matter this time or the next time or the time after that. The possibilities for ordinary people to play a greater role in shaping their city and nation than they do today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we're starting to have a few questions come in to the chat, and people who want to ask questions should start to get those coming in. While you prepare your questions, I'm just going to offer a few reflections on the papers, each one individually, and the kind of the questions that they raised for me about working class New York and the issues that the book and Josh's work more broadly presents. And actually, I think Merck's comments linking working class New York to In Transit and also American Empire, and then also Josh's Factories book, Behemoth, are also very helpful for kind of thinking about the, working class New York as part of a career-long investigation into these questions about agency, structure, and political change. So one of the responses that I imagine that Josh has often gotten to working class New York is that the city it chronicles sounds so different from the city we live in now. And in some ways, I think this response may be even more intense today than it was a quarter century ago when the book was published. looking at New York today and the experience of precarity that so many have, of high rents, low wages, a high level of insecurity in a city that so often seems directed to responding to the needs of the affluent. It's hard to, you read the book and you think, I would like to live in that New York. I'd like to time travel and go back there. But underneath this question, though, I think and underneath, in a way, all of these papers speak to the question, how strong and how viable was that social democratic city whose story Josh tells? What were the distinctive historical conditions that made that version of New York possible? How unified was it really? What were the fault lines and the divisions that made it difficult to protect in time? And also made the vision of progressive urbanism that it embodied hard to carry on. And most of all, maybe, could it be recreated or rebuilt today? What are the opportunities? What are the obstacles? How could it be given a more secure footing? So I think all these papers, in a way, to me, raise that question, as does much of the work that's been done about New York in recent years. And just to mention a few of the people working in the field, Mason Williams, Suleiman Osman, Johanna Fernandez, Lana D. Povitz, Benjamin Holtzman, Minju Bay, Pedro Legalato, Jessica Bird, Merlin Chakwanyan, Dylan Gottlieb, many other historians have been taking up, I think, the questions that Josh raises in Working Class New York, whether or not they've worked with him directly. And I think this is because these questions, as is the case for In Transit and Josh's later work too, are not just about New York. And all these studies, I think, are about New York, but also about the country as a whole. The nature of the post-war order, the promises it opened up, the avenues it foreclosed. So coming back to the papers for today, I think each of them addresses these themes in a different way. First, Pramila's comments and her work more generally lead us to consider who is the working class, who do we think of, and how to think about that work outside of the most union-dense parts of the economy, outside of the trades and the manufacturing companies that Josh suggests were so key to the structure of the city in the post-war years. What were the conditions of life and work like for women at home with children, for domestic workers, for sex workers, for people in the informal economy in one way or another? And to what extent did the post-war city hold out promise for them? How were their issues different? Is their exclusion or their limited inclusion in the post-war accord part of why it ultimately failed? In a way, are the people that Pramila has chronicled in her brilliant studies of welfare rights activists and domestic workers part of the working class New York that Josh describes? And how would a narrative that focused on these groups for the post-war city look different? I think in addition to this, and I think we'll be talking about this more in the afternoon, but it brings to mind some of the struggles over the post-war public sector. The strike of Black school children in the early 1960s against segregation in the school system, the strikes and protests at City College that over the segregation of CUNY and the absence of Black and Latinx students from the kind of flagship parts of the system in the late 1960s, which then paves the way for open admissions, the protests at Lincoln Hospital and elsewhere in the public system. All of these are about the divisions in the public sector, and to what extent are those divisions partly accountable, have to be thought about in considering the weaknesses that made it hard to protect this system when it came under more direct attack in the 70s. I think Pramila's work also raises the question about whether looking at these workers, these groups of workers who lived more precarious economic existences, even in the post-war years, does looking at their experience change the way that we think about the rise of neoliberalism? How, in some ways, were the experiences of these workers, more precarious workers, women, people of color? Is neoliberalism really a story of their experience being generalized to the white men who had been able to benefit? Or how to think about that relationship. I think her work brings that to mind, both for New York and also for the country as a whole. Will's paper raises a set of pressing and related questions, reminding us that public workers were really part of the group of workers who were initially excluded from the New Deal order, who operated under separate legal rules, not having access to collective bargaining rights as they had emerged in the 1930s and 1940s, and winning them state by state. And then also initially led, as I think he emphasizes or brings out of Josh's work very rightly, led by left-wing unions that were themselves excluded and written out of the post-war labor federations. I think when it also is important, that when public workers did win the right to organize, they met the opposition of conservatives very, very quickly and in intensely politicized ways. There isn't really a long, the whole period of the 40s, 50s, 60s, when private sector workers had the collective bargaining power that they did, at least in some industries, that is a much more foreshortened period for the public sector. And the politics of austerity follow very quickly on the successful unionization of the public sector. This despite the kind of continued, the relative union density in the public sector today. So what I see in Will's remarks more broadly is a question about whether the weakness of public sector unionism and the tenuous position of the public sector more broadly in the city is important for understanding the problems it encounters in the 70s. Didn't, in some ways, the public sector and the whole idea of public employment, public services, public resources being directed towards social services, these always encountered a great deal of ideological and institutional opposition all through the post-war years. So there's always a kind of political ambivalence at the heart of working class New York. In some ways, we might call it a social democratic city looking backwards, but how many of the leaders of the city, or even the leaders of the unions of the city at the time, would have named it thus? To what extent is there a kind of division around the politics and the way that the public sector is understood, articulated, defended in the city at the moment when it is the strongest? That also, in a sense, sets it up for the later problems it encounters. Andy's work takes up another theme running through working class New York, the economic transformations of the post-war years. And looking at the garment industry and the broader flight of manufacturing from the city, he shows the limits of the post-war regime and the ways that protecting it would have required a different approach to political economy in the city and even nationally. And I think that Andy's work is very helpful. There's surprisingly few studies of deindustrialization in New York. New York, just as Josh highlights, people don't think of it as a Rust Belt city in a way because of the decentralized and diverse nature of its industrial base. But what happens in New York is actually very much part of and anticipates the flight of industry from more single industry towns and cities throughout the Northeast and the Midwest, and should be understood as part of that broad shift. Andy's work echoes to me Gabe Renan's recent study of deindustrialization and the working class in Pittsburgh. And I think underneath this is another set of questions about how is the working class itself transformed by deindustrialization? And another is, again, as he points out, the stability of the post-war order. If it relied on industries as deeply exploitative as the garment industry was, is it not in a way doomed to failure from the start? How can we hope politically to resurrect something that was constructed on such shaky ground? And this finally brings me to Mark's paper and his reflections on the history of transit in the twilight of working class New York. And what Mark highlights as the point of comparison between the two eras is really political imagination, not just economic structure, not just political institutions, but the willingness of working class activists and organizers to imagine a different city, a different kind of union, a different world. And the tangible impact this had on material life is linked to the people's sense of agency and possibility and their imaginative sensibility towards the city and the future. And I think that this, here too, I think it is interesting to think, I'm looking forward to reading more of Merck's work and the very recent kind of interpretations of the labor movement in the city, in the public sector and private sector, and the way that workers understand the politics of their situation, the obstacles they encounter, and what this does to their ideas, their political ideas for the future. In a way, I think this brings us back to the city in the present day and the dilemmas that New York is facing now. And looking at the experience of the city over the pandemic time, especially last spring when the coronavirus ripped through working class neighborhoods of the city with such devastating force. On one level, it seems like it has highlighted, it cannot help but have highlighted the centrality of the public institutions, the hospitals, the public health system of the city, such as it is, as well as the essential workers who make up the city's working classes. In a way, this is very present now and today as we think the basic science and the intellectual labor that made it possible to develop the vaccines is meaningless without the nurses and the public health workers who can actually bring the vaccines to the people who need them, and also without the education that clarifies for people why vaccines matter in the first place and why they might work. I think also of the closure of the public schools this past year, or the partial reopening of the public schools, and the deep confusion and lack of leadership in the system that has kind of shaped the life of families throughout the city. The arduous and brave labor of the public school teachers and workers in the schools and the fragile communities that they've tried to build and sustain under these circumstances. But in a way, the kind of the specter of the literal closure of the system and has, I think, again, really brought home for people the very direct, immediate impact of the public sector on daily life. After the decline of the post-war city, the transformations of it after the fiscal crisis, the city's liberal leadership adopted the position that it was necessary to do almost anything to retain capital investment in the city and to keep a critical mass of affluent New Yorkers from departing. That this was actually necessary in order to maintain the tax base and any viable future for New York. I think this vision, in some ways, is coming under increasing skepticism and critique. And this was true prior to the pandemic, but it's also, maybe more true still in its wake. It no longer seems as incontrovertible to many in New York that adopting this set of policies really is in the best interest of the city. And I think the way forward is far from clear, but one has to wonder, is the era that Josh's book ends with itself reaching a conclusion? Might we be approaching a new turning point for the city as a whole? And I know, like many others, go back to Josh's work to think not only about the political chances and structures that enable the distinctive order of the post-war years to flourish, but also because it stimulates my own political imagination, helping me consider the possibility of a more equal, more just, more beautiful city in the future, not just in the past. So there's a lot more to say and a lot of other questions that these papers, both individually and together, bring up. And questions are now coming into the chat. So I don't know if any of you guys want to respond to anything that I said off to start with that, or should we just dive into the questions? Anybody want to jump in, or should I just pose the first of our questions that came in? Okay, I'll just go with the questions, and anybody can speak to this. This is for anybody. While unions help the working class, especially by offering benefits that have provided upward movement, how would you explain why unionized women in the entertainment industry received no protection as the Me Too movement exposed, problems in the industry? I mean, I guess one, yeah, it has, this is kind of, it's in no ways a specific question about the entertainment unions. So I don't know if anybody has a take on it or on, I suppose, the broader questions about the labor movement and sexual harassment.
Yeah, I actually, I don't know a lot about the entertainment unions. I was actually going to ask for a little more background about that, since I don't know a whole lot about it. But what, in terms of the question, the person who's asking the question, is it that there are women who are unionized, who are members of the union, who don't receive equal benefits? Or is it that women have largely been excluded from that union? So I guess I would like a little bit more information about exactly what they mean.
Yeah, I guess we can see if the questioner wants to write in or is able. I don't actually have that much more background to provide either, but if the questioner would like to write in, that would be, feel free.
But I will say, just, about the broader issue about gender and labor organizing. And we know that there's a very long history of women and immigrants and people of color who have been excluded from traditional labor unions from the 19th century and into a good portion of the 20th century. And that was based on protection for a particular group of workers. It was based on the idea of the breadwinner model, which assumed that men were the primary breadwinners in the household and that women didn't need to fight for or be a part of unions because they didn't need higher wages. Some of the assumptions were that women were working, quote unquote, for pin money or simply for supplementary wages for the household. So there has been a long tradition of either exclusion or secondary employment of women in terms of labor organizing. And there was also a fear, I think, among many labor leaders that women would take jobs away from men who needed those jobs. And the same was true for immigrants. A lot of exclusion for fear that immigrants would come to the United States and take away jobs from Native workers. And so that's been a very long history that people have been fighting against.
Perhaps I'll add something from my own history of transit. When this dissident caucus took over, and it was very much focused on especially concentrating on the most oppressed groups within the transit workers, people, traffic checkers, car cleaners, people that had traditionally been abused, groups that tended to be more African American, that tended to be more women. There was pushback from a lot of the more privileged or skilled groups of workers. Why are you concentrating so much on them? I talked to one of my informants talked about going out as a union staff rep and talking to people in the shops, in the locations, trying to make them understand why this was important to have the solidarity even within the union. And she said, if you talk to them enough about it, that they began to get it, right? But it was out of their experience. It was out of their learned experience. And you had to keep talking to them about it. And then at a certain point, the union leadership changed again and they stopped talking about it. And she said it just got lost because it wasn't yet ingrained into the way they thought about what the union should be doing, that it was not just what is the union doing for me, but what is the union doing for us.
I guess I just pick up on this I think this raises for me a connection back to Kim's comments. And I think, Kim asked, do the sort of does the ambivalence that about sort of the rights of public sector workers sort of contribute to their vulnerability in later periods? And I guess I would say that I think one sort of to broaden that question, to think about sort of the divisions and thinking about how sort of, or the limitations or blind spots in how we think of, what the working class is, who's a worker, what are workplace issues, does sexual harassment actually belong on a union contract, right? These are questions that I think suggest that they do make particular unions vulnerable. I think the public sector unions are, a lot of their history in the 70s is sort of thinking about the differences and vulnerabilities within the public sector movement today. I think we see it in the debate over police unions. What is the connection between police unions and the rights of police and other public sector workers? But I think it also points to the need to understand these as sort of broader questions about how we understand the union movement and the working class. I mean, the kind of questions that Pramila raised that, so it's not just the vulnerability of these particular unions, but I think does go back to the way in which the sort of in the post-war period, sort of policy approaches to defining work, defining the nature of the working class, do create blind spots that create, I think, a broader vulnerability for the union movement, for social democracy, or the sort of the New Deal system in general.
And I guess I could just add something. I know very little about the entertainment industry itself, but the question made me think back to earlier examples of unionization. Like, so in the CIO era, like in the electrical industry, for example, which the workforce was dominated by women. And, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse was a routine part of factory work in the electrical industry, particularly during the Great Depression. And what it shows you is that when you are in a situation of scarcity, it benefits those who are already powerful. You as a worker, you don't have leverage, you're desperate, you have few choices. But when unions organized, when they got power, they got leverage, one thing they do is they alter the balance of power on the shop floor. They reduce the arbitrary power of the boss. And that's why in the 1940s, for instance, one of the huge battles in the labor movement was a corporate offensive around what was called the right to manage. And this is around work rules and job security. When you have the union, when you have that job security, you reduce the power of the boss to demand things from you that you don't want. And so in the 30s and 40s, this was described as sort of a revolution on the factory floor. Of course, it remained totally incomplete, but that was an era when you saw a little bit of this kind of rebalancing.
Great. Well, our next question actually builds a little bit on these reflections, which is to any of our excellent panelists. Can you speak to the use of the rhetoric of the underclass as a means of reinforcing a separation between the politics and needs of people organized around class versus race and gender? So what is the impact? And this, I think one, the rhetoric of the underclass, which emerges really in the late 70s and 80s as a way of describing poverty, how, I think it points to another, question about how do people, if you were approaching or thinking about what issues might historians starting work in this area today or writing about kind of, about labor history in post-1970s New York, what themes, what problems might come to the forefront.
So yeah, I think that term underclass is a really interesting one. And the very term itself suggests that people are not a part of the class structure, but are beneath the class structure. And it is a very racialized concept. The underclass has historically been defined as people of color in New York, Puerto Rican, or African American. And it suggests that people are not working for wages, that they are living on welfare, getting public assistance. And there's also a number of other associations with the term underclass that have to do with sexuality and family formation and things like that. I think that the term underclass has been a form of division between, a form of division within the working class. Most people who we know who are a part of the underclass have worked, and they have worked intermittently. They may have worked for a period of time and gotten on public assistance for a period of time, but it is a framework that erases that group of people from how we understand the working class. And the suggestion was those people are in fact living off the tax dollars of people who are working. I think, one of the issues with, that has come up in this panel discussion and even in the previous discussion are the divisions among what we would call the working class. And it is about the underclass. It's about the politics of criminalization as well, which I know is going to come up a little later today. It has come up, I think, more recently in the pandemic, and this notion of essential workers who are also considered disposable, right? And so essential workers who are not given the protective equipment that they need, but in fact are serving workers who are staying at home and are able to work from home. I think we have to consider how to move forward to develop a social democratic policy that is more inclusive than we have seen thus far in US history. And I think for me, some of that means taking the lead of workers who are the most marginalized, who have been working to develop a more inclusive politics around race, around gender, and around the kinds of work that people do.
In the early parts of working class New York, when Josh is talking about working class having power in the city, right? He talks about how the unions, the labor movement, I'll just quote, what does he say? He says, they helped erect a social infrastructure that served New Yorkers far beyond its own ranks, right? Of an inclusionary policy rather than one that separated, my union or unions from the rest of the working class in New York. And he also points, I think, to a key moment where that starts to break down, which is the exclusion of the Communist Party and the left from the labor movements, right? About which he says, the route of the CP removed from New York working class politics the element most committed to winning and wielding social power. So, the union movement begins to fragment into what can I do for my own members, and giving up on what Pramila talked about, state-based protections.
I was thinking about Pramila's question of what would happen if we centered informal and precarious workers in our narratives about this era. And it struck me that when you're talking about the garment industry, at least, you are both doing and not doing that, because the racial and gender division of labor in the society at large was actually replicated in miniature within the industry. So, like, you have, for example, people working in the roles of cutters, sample makers. This is a relative elite among production workers who enjoy stable employment. They're nearly always men, whereas the people who sew the garments, who do not enjoy that stable employment, who are temporary contingent workers, are nearly always women. And the garment unions saw themselves as trying to formalize and stabilize that contingent work. But what strikes me when I look at it is that at the very time that they were, frankly, begrudgingly in a lot of cases, especially around race, trying to do this, their ability to do that and their power to do so was basically disintegrating.
think it's interesting that, I mean, the term underclass, I think in some ways points to a way in which class remains a really important way in which sort of mainstream political rhetoric, class remains important. And I think Pramila's right that the sort of assumption of the term is that these are people who are sort of outside of the class structure. I think, it indicates the ways in which the sort of post-war social compact assumed that employment, sort of wage employment, was an avenue for social citizenship and sort of attached it to it, and then made assumptions about who actually fit into that, right? So, I mean, one problem with the idea of underclass that people, address is that people who are not in wage work still work, right? So that's where we get, sort of talk about like numbers runners or drug dealers, right, who are not seen as in the formal economy, are actually working and actually participating in the political economy. But then people who actually are in wage work but assumed not to be, right? So, welfare recipients, right? The idea that they're not actually doing wage work alongside their welfare income. So I think it's actually, it's a telling phrase, even if we can, it's obviously very problematic. And I think, I think it points to the ways in which we have to understand that I think the broader political economy privileged an understanding of what work was, even in a country that tended to deny the importance of class.
Well, our next question is specifically directed at Andy, although I suppose other people might want to jump in with it as well, which is, do you think historical contingency somehow implies unitary systems? Certainly, market relations have a way of contaminating social democratic projects, but why should one system overwhelm all others in a complex federal structure?
Well, if the question is why did the market overwhelm the unions in the state, I think there are a couple answers to this. So one, the garment unions, at least that I studied, were never as strong as they were portrayed to be by the press, by the government, and by themselves. It's important to keep in mind that these were effectively new organizations. So the ILGWU, for instance, was like on its back and bankrupt and almost memberless during the Depression. It was effectively reborn in 1933. So it's like the organization was established in 1933. I was remembering that, Josh begins the book Working Class New York with a really vivid depiction of the post-war strikes that shut down the city. But at the same time, it's already a kind of elegy, at the very beginning of the book. And I think that connects to these questions around really the weakness of these organizations. And I think you also have to take into account that state support for the garment unions and for the unions more generally was also not as robust as I think we're sometimes led to believe. I mean, the state wanted to prevent crises, but I don't think the state was on board with a conscious movement towards social democracy that was created by workers. And so I think that the getting a handle of the concrete political character of that social democracy is can help answer those questions. I think on the part of the state, you also have basically a complacency about manufacturing and about working class jobs, and like an arrogant belief in the invincibility of New York, which of course is a very New York thing to have, but also in something called progress. And then I think to answer your question about like why does the market ultimately overwhelm the unions in the state power is fragmented compared to market power and the centrifugal forces that emerge from the dynamics of competition. And you can see this battle still going on today. Like even just in the past couple of days, Biden has released a plan to try and capture through taxation some profits that are reported overseas. And I think to me, the bottom line is the ultimate power in a capitalist system, which is the decision to invest or not to invest, lies with capitalists and not with states. And I think the New York City Fiscal Crisis, which Kim wrote the book about, is probably the spectacular example of that.
I could read another question just to keep the conversation going. So this is a question from Mark. Could you tell us a little bit more about your reflections on Professor Naddison's comments and how you think racial gender divisions might have played out in Local 100?
So it seems to me these are two different questions. So I'll just comment briefly on what Pramila said, and maybe she'll pick it up and expand more, and then move on to the other piece. I think this notion of the labor movement as being based in the working class as opposed to as in unions is really interesting. And we should be thinking about how to integrate that with, for example, the idea of bargaining for the common good, which has come up in various public employee unions, and how to go back to this idea of state-based protections more. And hopefully she'll have more to say on that. Let me talk a little bit about race and gender in transit. That in itself is two different questions. There's the question of how people were treated by management. So gender has become increasingly important in transit. If you go back to the 70s or early 80s, there were hardly any women in transit. But as the number has grown, and as the number, of course, broader of the people in transit that bear some responsibility, for example, for childcare, has grown, right? And management has provided no protections or assistance for them in squaring work responsibilities and home responsibilities, life responsibilities. That anger of workers has grown about that. Race has always been important in the treatment of workers. The disciplinary system in transit is just brutal, but it was especially focused, the disciplinary system was especially focused against people of color, and it was especially focused in the sections of transit which were dominated by people of color. But then, of course, there was also the union side. So by the 70s, the union structure was still dominated by the Irish, and to a lesser extent by other white European ethnic groups, whereas the workforce had become increasingly people of color. And two things then went on. On the one hand, there was kind of a drumbeat among those people of color. Well, when is our turn coming? When is our turn going to come? And on the one hand, the dissident group tended to run slates that were more people of color. And on the other hand, the incumbent union tried to fend this off by gradually changing the makeup of the leadership as well, so that by the final election in which the dissident caucus won, there were two African Americans. Well, one African American running against a West Indian American running for office. So, but then more recently, this is an interesting question. I don't really have an answer to it. So the West Indian immigrant, Roger Toussaint, won in 2000, and he served as president until 2008, and he handed over power in the middle of his term to an African American leader. And when that guy ran in 2009 for re-election, he lost to a white guy, John Samuelson, an Irishman. And so it does raise the question of whether race had become less important in the union, of whether, and I'm thinking about this, of whether, in a sense, transit workers had, as a whole, had moved beyond race as a criteria in thinking about what their union could do for them.
So I'll just pick up a little bit there. Thank you, Mark, for that. I also just wanted to say, Mark, I just really appreciated your comments, especially as it related to your experience as a transit worker, because I think that brings a very important dimension to our understanding of working class struggle in New York City. So yes, I think the question of broadening our understanding of the labor movement is absolutely critical for imagining what a new labor movement or labor organizing could look like. And so we could just take something like the Fight for 15 movement, which is a movement that has embraced workers from many different sectors and many different occupations. So it includes home health care aides. It also includes restaurant workers and taxi drivers and nail salon workers. For me, that's a model for how we can begin to rethink labor organizing, which is often based in particular industries or particular occupations. Workers have to begin to connect with one another across occupation, across sectors. And the idea of a $15 an hour minimum wage is a good starting point for that. But I also think we can begin to imagine, as I suggested very briefly, even a broader notion of working class struggle. And so we can look at the Black Lives Matter movement, which, from a very superficial perspective is focused on the death of particular individuals. But I think the campaigns and the movement around Black Lives Matter is actually much broader. It's about defunding the police. It's about disinvesting from police and reinvesting in communities. It's about prison abolition. So how can we understand those campaigns and those demands as part of a different kind of working class politics? Or we could talk about the immigrant rights movement, right? And immigration might seem like an issue that is very distinct from labor issues, but in fact, the movement for immigrant rights is very connected to the question of labor and working class security in this country, because the state, vis-a-vis ICE, has been used as a way to crack down on workers, especially immigrant workers, but not only that, and to sow divisions between native-born workers and immigrant workers. So that's part of the challenge before us. I do work with a group in Mississippi called the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative that is fighting for expanded child care assistance for women on welfare in Mississippi. I imagine them as a part of our working class struggle, fighting for childcare for low-income women, extremely important. Or we can look at the work that Dean Spade has done around mutual aid, about the ways in which communities have come together to provide economic and political support. And so I think there is a way in which we can really expand our notion of what the working class is and about the ways in which working class people have struggled for economic security and for community betterment as a way to move forward. Because ultimately, for me, that is what social democracy can look like, especially in this moment of neoliberalism.
Can I just add to that one thing, which is that sometimes all these movements seem disconnected from each other so that they're less than the sum of their parts. And that's this idea of wielding social power. That's the challenge, is to bring them back into this idea that they are all part of a working class movement.
We have about 5 more minutes here, and we have 2 questions. So maybe I'll put both the questions out there, and then people can speak to either or both. We had one question about 1199, about situating the rise of 1199 in particular in the post-war period, specifically from 1959 to the 90s and up to today, pointing out that this was a union that was led by the best of the left tradition in the CIO, organizing an industry composed of overwhelmingly women of color in an industry, especially hospitals, that are large and stable shops. So they're not runaway shops like the one that Andy is talking about. All these factors may make 1199 an exceptional case. What lessons can be learned, if any, for the rest of the labor movement? So I think that's one question about 1199 and maybe more generally about the healthcare sector as a site of labor conflict. And then the other question is, why did police unions in New York get to keep their power in the neoliberal era, as opposed to TWU or the other municipal workers unions after the fiscal crisis? Yeah, and I actually would add to this a bit, and I don't know if that just, is it, I think that the municipal unions even today are not completely powerless. So how do you think about what kind of power they exert in the city as a whole? So, but I think the point about police and the role of the police, not just in contract negotiations, but in the politics of the city more generally, how to think about that is important. So anybody who would like to speak to either of those questions,
can I take
synthesizing them together?
At both of them?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I guess I would argue that 1199 is not exceptional. I think if you look at the sort of patterns that we see in AFSCME and SEIU, not just in New York, across the country, we see very similar patterns of growth. And it's also occurring within a highly circumscribed system of collective bargaining that so the Taylor Act, I mean, imagine in New York City that liberals are passing a law that allows union officials to be jailed and fined for leading strikes, right? Like that's not a permissive law, right? It's a very highly circumscribed law. And I think it actually gets to the second question in the way in which I think these rights that public employees gain are dependent upon political support. And what distinguishes police is that, public employees generally are supported by liberals who are also very ambivalent about their rights and seeing the value of the labor that they do. Police generally don't experience that ambivalence, and certainly from conservatives, right? So police are the only public employees who have sort of bipartisan consensus that their services are valued, that their work is, respected. I think that's started to change, but largely I think the power of police unions comes from the sort of view of their work and their value, both from conservatives and liberals.
Yeah, and to add to that on the question of the police unions, just to answer really schematically, I think it's because what police do was integral to the new political economy of the city. The city's one-time working class was no longer a meaningful engine of accumulation, and it was now a problem to be managed and to be repressed. The money is now in finance, broadly construed, and in real estate. And the real estate industry caters to people who have benefited from racial and class domination, and it is a key institution in reproducing that domination. And the police are its allies, but you got to pay them, and that's the source of their power.
We shouldn't overestimate police power. They are powerful in their workplace, but as far as their wages and benefits, they are also stuck in the same pattern bargaining with the rest of New York City's public employees. But right next door to Will in Wisconsin is the classic example of where the police were exempted from the anti-union provisions of in Wisconsin. 1199, we should just differentiate the current 1199, which is based on political power, from the original struggles to form the union, which were based on this really powerful conjunction of, on the one hand, building shop floor power right in the hospitals, and then the alliance with the civil rights movement. So we have this inside-outside political strategy that helped build the union in the first place.
Well, we're just about at time. I think one more question has come in, which anyone could speak to very briefly, which about the role of unions. And I think this gets to a question that is also, is an important issue to think about the role of unions in allowing the implementation of workfare during the 90s, or more broadly, the complicity of unions and of maybe especially public sector unions in the different forms of retrenchment in the city. What could have been done differently? I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that, or we want to just leave that out there as a question, but.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly. I mean, I think that speaks to, a number of themes that came up, and I think it's about sort of beginning to overcome these divisions within the working class that have so animated labor organizing historically in this country, although I think we are beginning to move away from that. But the possibilities for alliances across race lines, class lines, and I think workfare was one of those, which is tied to the notion of the underclass, right? People who are getting public assistance and not deserving of public assistance, and who are seen not as a part of the working class. So I think we need to begin to think about how to overcome those divisions around race, around identity, around who's a worker and who's not a worker.
Excellent. Well, I think that the next panel today actually will continue some of these themes and conversations. The panel on Black and Latinx organizing in the city in the post-war years. But I think this panel gives a sense and of just the richness of working class New York and the importance of continuing the area of study that Josh helped to map out, both in the period that he chronicles and beyond. So thank you so much to everybody, and thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
Look forward to the conversation continuing, and thank you to Josh most of all.
Yeah, thanks everyone.